each and every year in our fantasy leagues, we always have that one guy, and you know the exact guy that I'm thinking of, the guy that's reaching on all of their players, using last season's metrics to determine the success and output of players this year, and thinking that they've cracked the fantasy code and they're going to leave you in the dust. I'm here to tell you that they haven't. And today I'm going to be breaking down 5 players that you should absolutely let your idiot league mates draft because they're essentially handing you the trophy in doing so. So sit back, take notes, and whatever you do, do not be that guy. Let's get right into it. All right, up first, we have the Kansas City wide receiver core. And there are a couple of different reasons why that I'm avoiding the entirety of the Kansas City receiving core, despite the fact that they have Patrick Mahomes. And, when you look at all of the different players that are in this wide receiver room, you look at Rashee Rice, you look at Xavier Worthy, you look at Hollywood Brown, they all have things going on. Rashee Rice is looming on a suspension. He's probably going to get half the games this season at minimum, which opens up the wide receiver room even more, as much as people who love Xavier Worthy don't want to admit he's not really a wide receiver one type. He just isn't. He doesn't have that build. He doesn't have that model. He's just not that guy. I think he needs a guy like Rashee Rice on the opposite of him in certain types of plays to become more successful. And I know he had some success last year with him being gone, but I do think he benefits a lot more from other players being dominant around him. That being said, he was, fairly decent to some degree. Although he only had 1 week of wide receiver 15 or better, that is challenging a lot of what people believe he is expected to be. Number 40 in fantasy points per game in 2024 at the wide receiver position. He had only 600 yards with almost 100 targets. And I do believe that Kansas City will focus on running the ball more, especially with Isaiah Pacheco and Kareem Hunt being a 1-2 punch that I believe that they are. In addition to this, Hollywood Brown hasn't been good really since 2021. I don't expect that to change this year. This is a KC offense that was down the last 2 years compared to their dominance prior. They were number 15 both last year and the year before in points. I don't see that improving. I don't feel like they improved very much on offense. I feel like they drastically got a little worse, especially with Rashee Rice dealing with his off-field issues. And Kansas City hasn't had a 1,000-yard receiver in 3 years. I don't expect that to change. I really don't. I expect probably a couple guys around the 800 mark, and that's about it. So I would just avoid this receiver room altogether. It's a waste of a pick. They're going around, pick 40. Both Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy are. I wouldn't spend a pick on that. I'd rather have a guy like DK Metcalf there, who I know is going to be the wide receiver one, and he's going to demand targets. I just don't know what's going on here, so I don't want any part of it. Up next, I have none other than Amon-Ra St. Brown. And don't get me wrong, Amon-Ra has been good the last couple of years. He has been really good, and he's only gotten better. But I do think the Lions are going to have a down year compared to what they had last year. Ben Johnson obviously leaving is a huge, huge blow to the Lions. I don't think that their new offensive coordinator is going to replicate that success to that same level. And that affects everybody in this offense, and particularly Amon-Ra St. Brown, who scored on 8.5% of his targets in 2024. This is up compared to the 4 to 5% that he had the previous years in his career. So I think he's set for a regression. On top of that, Detroit lost 2 major offensive linemen in Ragnow to free agency and Zietler in the offseason. Ragnow to retirement and Zietler to free agency. So they're going to take it, a small step back. I do expect them to still win the division. I do expect them to still be playing good football, but going from number 2 in points per game and the number 1 offense, there's really, unless you replicate that kind of measurement, there's nowhere to go really but down, and I think that's going to affect him greatly. The Lions have the 3rd toughest schedule in the entire NFL, and there are a couple of guys that I'd rather have around him that I'm sure are going to be great. I entrust in Derrick Henry. I have a lot of shares of Derrick Henry, and I think that Malik Neighbors could be a fantasy winner this year, even at the first pick. That's a great pick for me. I'd rather have those two guys who are going around the same spot in that first round that Amon-Ra St. Brown are. That's just my preference. Again, it's just going to happen. They're going to regress. Up next, at number 3, we have Travis Hunter. And this one is going to come to as a shock to everybody, especially with the depth chart being released. I believe it was yesterday. Travis Hunter being listed as the wide receiver 2 in the Jaguars offense, whereas he is a second stringer defensive back. I still don't want any part of him. He's currently going at 64th overall, wide receiver 30, and he's going before wide receiver 1s in offenses that I feel like are going to have no choice but to really throw the ball a lot. Olave, I'm not too quite sure of, but he is a wide receiver 1. Jerry Jeudy, I have no doubt, is going to demand targets, and Calvin Ridley might be my favorite pick of the year. So I do think that he is being overdrafted. And if he plays both offense and defense, I saw a story which Liam Cohen said that Travis Hunter is expected to play about 80% of the snaps on offense, and he's expecting him to have a similar type of snap count on defense because he's Travis Hunter. I don't want anybody that's going to be playing both sides of the ball, and that's very controversial, but he's going to be more prone for injuries. He's going to have his body hit a lot more. This is the NFL. I think Travis Hunter is a phenomenal player. I think he is one of, the best players to come out recently into the NFL from college in I don't know how long. I truly do. But I don't want any part of somebody who's going to be playing, a majority of the snaps throughout the entire game. Not knowing what all he will do on offense as well kind of is too much of a risk for me in that 6th round. I have at least 10 players, after him that I would much rather have over him because I know what they're going to do. I know what I can expect from them. And experts, regardless of these stats, they all have him ranked 20 spaces behind his current ADP. And most of the time, I would go at the experts who I feel like, have some very, controversial takes. But in this aspect, I do agree with them. Travis Hunter should be much lower than where he's going. He needs to be dropped a little bit. Focus on those wide receiver 1s. Travis Hunter is not going to win you your league this year. Up next, we have Baker Mayfield. And Baker Mayfield is very interesting because I do think that he has the potential to be a quarterback 6, but I don't think that he's going to be quite there. And he's one of those guys where you can grab him as, the QB6 off the board. But if he does any worse than that, then it's almost like you wasted a pick because you could have had another flex player that would have potentially, won you your fantasy leagues. Whereas you could have gotten similar production from Baker Mayfield in a later round. And it's guys like Purdy, guys like Herbert, guys like Dak, that I view in those later rounds that I feel like can be similar fantasy quarterbacks to Baker this year. Guys that are on pretty good offenses that I think are going to produce 17 to 18 points minimum week in and week out. And I just kind of rather have those guys in those offenses. That being said, Baker Mayfield did have a great year last year, 7.2% touchdown rate, which was the 2nd highest in the NFL. But he's also in his 3rd offensive coordinator in 3 years. Now with Josh Grizzard, how's he going to utilize this offense? I don't know yet. I'm not quite sure yet. And they're going to be without their best offensive lineman for 4 games, most likely. So that affects Baker Mayfield as much as, losing a receiver. He needs his top offensive lineman to play, and Wirfs is one of the best in the game. He did finish his QB4 last year with 41 touchdowns, but I'm expecting a major touchdown regression, probably between the mid to low 30s. I would say between the 32 to 35 or 36 range is probably what I'm going to expect, which, 5 touchdowns That's a lot of points. Considering yardage, considering touchdown points themselves, that makes a couple QB spots difference usually. He's being drafted, I feel, near his ceiling, which means that he's being drafted. I could see him going as like QB3 as his height, and he's kind of being drafted close to that. I'd prefer a player who's being drafted kind of near their floor. I think that Purdy, Herbert, and Dak in particular are consistently disrespected in terms of fantasy, and I want to take a crack at those guys who are being drafted much lower. You know, who are going to play, I feel, near their ceiling this season. Whereas I feel like Baker is going to be playing more toward his middle to toward his ceiling, but not quite at his peak. And last but not least, we have none other than DJ Moore, who has been a popular person on lists like these throughout the offseason. He's currently going as the wide receiver 20, 42nd overall, around that same range that guys like Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy are. That is pretty crazy for a wide receiver 1. So I, very much have a preference of Sutton and DK Metcalf. Again, I've said this multiple times in this range. Ben Johnson is going to try his best to replicate whatever he can find on the ground in Chicago with DeAndre Swift. And I think that it's going to create, madness for DJ Moore. I think he's going to struggle in this offense, which is an absolutely loaded offense, to find that same kind of fantasy success that we saw 2 years ago. This is an offense that added Luther Burden III and Colston Loveland. They've already had a Dunze. There's a new offensive scheme that he's had to learn and, mimic his game around. It's a lot adding into, the Bears being potentially a very good team, but DJ Moore's fantasy success being put at risk. And I just don't want any part of it. Last year, he had the 51st target rate, and that was with a lot less talent around him than he's got right now. They added more talent. And I can't see that improving. I can't see that improving by much, at least. For 51st in target rate for a wide receiver 1 is absolutely insane. It's just not going to be it's not going to be any better in my opinion. I think it's going to be a lot of, running the ball, pass catching out of the backfield, seeing what they can do with their tight ends like they did with Laporta, not last year, but the year prior. And it's just not going to involve as much DJ Moore as I feel like people would like. That being said, last year he was bad. He, 4 out of 17 weeks as wide receiver 10 or better. That's not what you want out of, wide receiver 1. His best week outside of those 4 was wide receiver 26, which means he wasn't putting up the same type of fantasy points. He just wasn't. And this year, I don't see it being any better. So avoid him. Keep him off your list. And that's going to do it for me, guys. If you guys like this video and you guys want to see more videos like it, make sure you comment, like, smash that subscribe button. We're almost to 1,200 subscribers. Please, let's get there. That would be amazing. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.